Hello and welcome again to Politics of Southeast Europe and the third segment on violence. We ended the previous segment by talking about the way in which the emergence of the crisis frame leads to the development and promotion of eliminationist ideologies. I want to talk a little bit more now about eliminationist ideologies, how these contribute to violence. What I'll be drawing on mostly in this presentation is the study by Dan Shiro and Clark Macaulay on mass political murder, in which they do a comparative analysis of all of the large-scale political murders that they're able to find in history, and try to pull out of them some of the elements that they regard as similar. And the title may be a bit of a giveaway here, but one of the things that they settle on is eliminationist ideology. So let's talk about this eliminationist ideology. The basic principle of eliminationist ideology is that the solution to the main problem that is faced by one group is the removal, the extermination, the deportation, the destruction of another group and the members of that group. What are the motivations for the emergence of eliminationist ideology? Shiro and Macaulay identify four main motivations. One is convenience. It would be nice. It would help to achieve a goal. A second is revenge. That is the belief that there is a grievance against the group and the members of this group that is unaddressed. The third is fear of extermination. That is the belief that if they do not destroy this group, then the group will destroy them. And finally, the fourth is cultural, relies on fear of pollution, of destruction of some element of the national or the ethnic or other collective essence as a result of the activity of this opposing group. So these are on the intellectual level. What arguments are developed for eliminationist ideologies? What are the factors that lead people to accept and to participate in eliminationist ideologies? Those are largely on the level of social psychology. They deal with the impulse for people to be obedient, to conform. They deal with the existence of organizations promoting the goal and being effective in promoting the goal. And this includes, probably most importantly, the engagement of political leadership. And finally, they involve the basic human emotions of fear and of hate, as well as emotions like love and disgust. We can think of all of these on the collective level as being kind of byproducts of the process by which one identity is glorified and one identity is dehumanized. Okay, now this does not happen all the time. It doesn't happen all of the time when the conditions that we've listed here as psychological explanations are met. What can we say about the times when large-scale violence does happen? There are two main factors. One is one consistent element that appears every time you find a genocide taking place, and think about genocides that you know about. You'll find that this is there, is the existence of a majority group which has and promotes the fear that members of a minority group present an essential threat to them, will cause their distinction. Okay, so the first major correlate is fear, and we can think of fear as a psychological characteristic of human beings, but we can also think of fear as representing a process where there is a political divide, and where it's a political divide that is defined by things like the perception of the threat of extinction. The evocation of fear is going to be mutually reinforcing, and the portrayal of members of one group as an essential threat is going to be matched on the other side by portrayals of the other group as a potential threat. And this is done through the creation of events and incidents, through propaganda, and through exploitation of shared memory and of myth. That is, through the engagement of media and through history. So these are processes that could fall broadly under the category of social psychology. let's look at what a social psychologist has to say about genocide and group violence. And I'm not going to go into tremendous detail in his explanation of participation in violence, which is in part social and in part clinical, but I want to draw out some of the main elements of his argument. And here are those elements. First of all, violence is a behavior, and like every other kind of human behavior, violence is learned. So how does learning take place? Learning takes place through observation, habituation, reinforcement, through the perception that violence is normal, through the consistency of violence with ideas that are widely promoted. That is to say, that an environment in which there is already violence, or in which violence is promoted or articulated as a goal, or represents a part of a political ideology, is going to be more conducive to the actual conduct of violence. And what this means then is that when we talk about perpetrators of violence, not necessarily about unusual people, but about people responding to environments that are unusual, in which unusual activity like violence appears to be normal. And a central part of this involves dehumanization. That is, this intellectual and ideological energy that takes members of the targeted group and places them outside of the universe of moral consideration, that postulates a degree of difference between them and the other group, or between them and the rest of humanity, that means that their safety, their interest does not have to be taken into account. Dehumanization amounts to a license to commit violence and to destroy people. But what we need to keep in mind, a lot of what I've said deals with factors that are psychological or social psychological. It might be tempting to reduce mass violence to psychology, but it is obviously also a political fact. And this is where Ben Valentino comes in, a political scientist, with his explanation. And what Valentino does is he tries to take these factors that people like Staub have outlined and put it into the context of political goals and political motivations. And this is a contribution in the sense that it moves us out of the trap of thinking of large-scale violence as irrational. State policy is frequently awful, but it is usually not created without any regard to rationality. Rather, it is created as a way of achieving goals. And typical goals here would be to counter threats or to implement ideologies. So Valentino looks at instances of mass violence, of the destruction of communities from more recent history, and and here's what he finds. He finds that in civil conflicts, the basic condition for mass killing is the disappearance of a distinction between military opponents and the surrounding population. I would also add in that this relates to incidents of what's been labeled, probably unfortunately, certainly vaguely, as ethnic cleansing in the states of the former Yugoslavia, that the rationally articulated goals of state and parastate institutions involve changing the population to suit geopolitical objectives. So what do we get by looking at this this set of explanations of violence? I think maybe an understanding of ways in which fear is created and in which fear is mobilized. Everybody, of course, all of us and all of you experience fear. One thing we can say about fear that might be self-evident is that fear is on its own frequently persuasive. It doesn't need anything added to it to be a motivation for action, and the repetition of the conditions that lead to and that enhance fear make it more persuasive. So when we talk about persuasion, the persuasiveness of invitations to fear depend upon some factors. What do they depend on? First of all, they depend on the ability of people to check information that they receive against other sources. This is, of course, something that is more difficult under conditions of authoritarian control, over conditions of lack of diversity in media or lack of access to information. Of course, several political factors contribute to this. And another factor that contributes to the persuasiveness of fear is enhanced uniformity in the social environment. That is the kind of sharing and centering around the favored identity that is favored by the crisis frame that is described by Oberschall. And in this environment of fear, then we talk about, you've probably come across this phrase before, the sidelining of the moderates. Anything short of advocacy of the eliminationist ideology appears to be something close to betrayal. When we talk about then the way that violence actually occurs and the creation of victims through violence, here are some aspects of violence that we will probably want to keep in mind. First, some victims are created intentionally and some are created accidentally. The crisis frame encourages an erasure of the distinction between these two categories. Second, the use of violence is often strategic. And when we talk about strategy, the strategy of violence very often has two goals. One is what could be called preemptive revenge. I'm aware that this phrase is an oxymoron, but that is the causing of damage or elimination of a group in order to prevent this group from causing damage or engaging in elimination themselves in the future. And a second is the effort to raise costs for opposition to opponents and potential opponents. That is, to encourage the development and enhancement of this uniformity that that makes the commission of violence more likely. Another factor you'd add is that violence, every time it is tried for the first time. Sometimes there is a second try and sometimes there is not. The absence of a response to violence against civilians makes the occurrence of future violence against civilians more probable. And this means that we can talk about a pattern. Where is the highest probability for large-scale violence to occur? It is when violence is committed by a side that is afraid of the victims, is winning, has the capacity to commit violence, and that has not faced retaliation. That is, that has been encouraged to think that they have a license to commit violence. And then a final point that I would make about the structure of violence is that we can talk about physical violence and we also need to talk about cultural violence, violence directed against identity and memory. This includes things like the destruction of religious and cultural sites, the targeting of members of the elite within a group in order to weaken communities, and a lot of post-violence activity could be thought of as cultural violence in the sense that it involves contestation over memory, and in particular, contestation over memory that takes the form of denial.